I thank Merujeen for giving me this opportunity to speak on my understanding of violence, and I will be happy to share a few words on the topic, what I understand by violence, with a focus on gender violence or violence as against women in particular. To talk about what is violence or what do I think about violence is a difficult question. This understanding of violence usually, most of the time, comes from the position of witnessing violence on the street, on screen, or maybe through descriptions. That becomes the basis of my thinking about violence. That is, thinking from a distance about the intelligibility of violence. Otherwise, do I think about violence at all? Or, in order to make my life easy, I train myself not to see violence unless it comes to me as an exceptional event of brutality and pain brought to one by another and remains with me as long as its effects lasts. I will come back to my role as a witness to violence a little later. To start with, I would say that there are social and historical contexts of violence. That is, violence is never pure, if I may say. That is, violence is found, most of the time it is found that there are motivational factors, causation, validity claims that characterize violence. That is, in our traditional thinking, we look for causative origin of violence, both causative and subjective origin of violence, such as what causes an individual to engage in the act of violence against another, to understand the extent and nature of violence in the act, etc. Mostly from the point of view of sociology, psychology, and also criminology. Yes. Again, when we think a little deeper, maybe from a contrasting point of view, beyond the immediate motive of the act of violence, we are often led to think that there is a social dynamics of violence. That is, we shift away from the concrete physical act of violence, the realm of individual or collective, towards the invisible and inherent violence of the social order. The inherent structure of the society refers to the interface of material conditions such as economic structures, history, and the systems of power and domination. Structural violence thus describes how phenomena such as poverty, political chaos, social inequalities, and historical trends cause suffering in the form of violence for many, and also at the same time remains anonymous, invisible, without perpetrators. But in terms of gender, we find women are the hardest hit, both economically exploited as well as socially oppressed. Women belong to the lowest tier of the economic and social structure, but in this way of thinking, most of the time we fail to grasp the why and how of it. Another similar conception, similar if I may say so, of Pierre Bourdieu is the theory of symbolic violence, which describes individuals or groups as complicit in the orders of institutionalized violence such as racism, gender, or class domination, where violence becomes rooted in practice and patterns of habitation of social life. Symbolic violence is not something that we accept or reject as a capacity or even a possibility, but it is something that we are effectively born into, where violence is not a response but a condition. The violence here is invisible and is not marked off by resistance. Rather, it is hidden with an acceptance of an order of things, a habitus that operates at the level of the social construction of the mind. But again, with respect to gender violence, we realize that overlap of categories creep into the analysis, which we identified as variegated forms of violence, folded into the social as discrete and invisible. Yet, that what we recognize as violence, whether that can be brought to explicit concepts, to an intelligibility of violence, is not revealed. And then what about intelligibility of gender violence? Besides, when we talk about the many faces of violence, we do not articulate a connection, a constitutive connection between the different forms of violence. Most of the interdisciplinary analysis, as they are no doubt very rich, but they do not help us to grasp the very phenomenon of violence. Instead, what we find, it gives us it gives rise to an entangled series of binaries, a number of binary conceptions such as sense and senseless violence, legit and illegitimate, visible and invisible violence, counter violence, etc. We see them as interplay of law, of moral coding, of order and disorder in the society. And these notions predetermine our understanding of violence. However, from these analysis, intelligibility of gender violence or understanding violence against women, apart from its invisibility and givenness of the social and historical background, is, I would say, quite far away. In this context, I would like to refer to violence as a form of working as against action. That this way of designating violence by is of course by Hannah Arendt, who she had raised this in Human Condition, this issue. That is, violence as a working aims to introduce a causal chain where one does not exist, say in an intersubjective relation. And violence as a form of action means it brings forth a relationality in the act. Now, such an instrumental notion of violence, however, leads to an individualization of the causes of violence, leading further to naturalization and essentialization, suppressing the socio-dynamics of violence. That is, according to Arendt, It is not to consider violence as a sociogenetic remnant or a sociogenetic relic as a working of one, but as an act within the sense structure, either as sense destroying or as sense bestowing. Citing the analogy of anti-Semitism and colonialism, both Arendt and Sartre, each in their own way, Arendt dwelling on legitimacy and justification with respect to violence and power, while for Sartre it is ethical implications of violence in scarcity. Violence in scarcity, I repeat. Also concepts of freedom and resistance. Both of them referring to phenomenology as relationality of experience in their nuanced theory of the self, its subjectification and its empowerment. Sartre presupposes a strong subject against the backdrop of the discursive and rational human being. This understanding of violence is relational, which proposes to change the register of analysis, that is, instead of the discursive circles of violence and counter-violence, he turns our attention to our embodiment, in which our openness or indifference towards vulnerability of both our others as well as ourselves are at stake. It is with this subjective perspective to understand violence as violence is done, as it is suffered, and as it is witnessed, that I would like to proceed. That is, the experience of violence, the subject relativity of appearance, that what appears to the subject and creates meaning in connection with the appearance of violence. In light of this approach, then one correlates not to violence as such, but to the intersubjective sense that experience generates. Thus, violence as intention, violence as effect, or violence as experience of one no longer hold, but violence as what appears in the intersubjective process. Now, this is phenomenology of violence or phenomenological approach to understand violence. To consider the dimension of relational sense formation in which violence occurs. That is, in which violence becomes possible and opens a path for its own sense. The idea of reciprocal constitution between the I and the other is, of course, post-Husserlian, I would say, that there is no longer the strong subject with intentionality that Husserl had proposed. In a critical assessment of Husserl's ideas, Levinas has shown that my encounter with the otherness of the other, in fact, implies a constitutive effect on me. This signifies that I do not coincide with myself and that absolute self-presence and identity are illusions. On the basis of this insight, understanding of violence is always interpersonal and interactive. And that allows us to shift from having a perpetrator and a victim of violence. And this shift is a shift to inflicting of violence, suffering from violence or violation, and witnessing of violence. Having said this, I would like to explore the notion of violence against women in reference to Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Although Beauvoir does not discuss gender violence or violence against women per se, but the intersubjective perspective that she projects, she considers woman as the other of the subject man in her positing of the perpetually oppressed woman. She brings in sexual difference into the notion of intersubjectivity. And unlike other intersubjective relations of man as master and man as slave, as Jews and as anti-Semites, as colonizers and as colonized, there is an uniqueness to the intersubjectivity with regard to man and woman that Beauvoir refers to. Among all these others, woman is a special case, she would say. Woman who bears the ontological truth of violating the other as subject, a refusal to acknowledge mutual vulnerability of man and woman, and a failure of justice for woman as sexed. For the Jews, for the slaves, or if you instead of slaves you might call them proletariat, there is a whole historical development which explains their existence, according to Beauvoir. But for the female other, however, there is no historical event or historical development of oppression. There have always been women, and as far back as history can be traced, they have always been oppressed by men. In her 1949 book, The Second Sex, Beauvoir begins with the basic question of female otherness. How did it all begin? This is the question of denying woman as a subject, which she brings forth and which has remained unsolved, and she attempts an explanation in the book, in her magnum opus, The Second Sex. Beauvoir's understanding of intersubjectivity follows the Hegelian master-slave framework and phenomenology, and it gives a new direction, a kind of application, I would say, to both the strands to which Beauvoir did not want to be identified with, either as existentialist or as phenomenologist. But this renders her understanding of violating the other, failing to see oneself in the other, and this is, she would underline, the tragedy of human condition. This is an ontological truth that the existentialist in her would say, which is revealed in the intersubjectivity between man and woman, and this is the unique part of her analysis. According to Beauvoir, woman's relation to man is as sexed. The relationality, however, even in its extreme violent form, is such that it does not include annihilation or death of the other. It is not a subjectivity that exists between man as the master, the anti-Semite, the colonizer, and the man as the slave, the Jew, the colonized, that aims to annihilate the claims to subjectivity for man. Complete annihilation of the other follows from we know Hegel's master-slave dialectic. But woman, according to Beauvoir, is not an absolute other of man. Rather, it is threat of annihilation that works for woman. It is a perpetual act of oppression to facilitate a vulnerable and dependent other, who is the woman, so that the challenges to the claims to subjectivity for man may never arise at all. This is where she invokes sexual difference into the notion of intersubjectivity in a very distinct way. Although Beauvoir has remained within the heterosexual normative boundaries in her theorization, her book, we know, is titled as The Second Sex and can be multifariously read just as the word sex in the title. She begins by asking the question, what is a woman? And then engages with the position of woman, denigrated as the sex. Positing woman as the second sex, Beauvoir assigns ambiguity of subjectivity to work for woman, but in a way different from that of man. She persistently inquires and explains why the subject-other relation between man and woman is biased against woman and keeps her subordinated and inferior to man. Extending this concept of ambiguity in the relational flow of intersubjectivity has helped me to get an idea of the violence against woman perpetrated by man. It has helped me to grapple and come up with an understanding of gender violence, also in the intersectional ways, and especially I would say violence such as rape or intimate partner violence, or even say acts like acid attacks performed solely on women. As Beauvoir explains, ambiguity of subjectivity is a composite of conscious being and an embodied being. That is, as humans, we are both conscious beings, subjects who bring meaning and value to the world, and also embodied beings at the same time, that is, material objects in the world. Existing as subject for myself, bringing meaning to the world, and object for others as instrument, not as person, renders our living in this world as vulnerable to others' judgment and powers. And this is our ambiguous and vulnerable existence. As embodied material object, my body is vulnerable to the wounds of flesh inflicted by others, and as subjects, I am vulnerable to the ways that destroy and corrupt the meanings and values I carry and create. I exist as ambiguity of both subject and as object. This intersubjective, ambiguous condition is not always a Mitsein. The German word Mitsein is being with a situation, a condition where reciprocity exists. There does not exist justice of reciprocity, that is to respect each other's vulnerability and not reduce the other to a thing or instrument in the world that we live. And according to Beauvoir, this being with other position, it is not always of friendship and solidarity, that is Mitsein. There exists hostility. there comes up the intention of exploiting the vulnerability of the other and failing to see oneself in the victims. And of course also its reverse is this is a failure to fulfill the demands of reciprocity. This sole assertion of one comes through objectification of the other. I as the subject perceive the world and others as my other. My other reveals the relativity of my subjectivity, my being. How I respond is, of course, undecidable. I may welcome you, befriend you, accept you, or I may attempt to destroy your subjectivity. It is not given, but what is given is ambiguity, which is intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity with hostility to the other and assertion of my subjectivity. Assertion of my subjectivity manifests through subordination and domination of the other. Between any two humans, violence is a tactics to enforce claims of absolute subjectivity, reducing the other to an instrument or object. For the other, reciprocation is marked by struggles of freedom. For the slaves, for the colonized, for Jews, blacks, or even Dalits, to turn the subject-other relation to a subject-subject relation. Struggles of freedom is therefore emancipatory. Violating the other is a tragedy of human condition. Violence is enacted to hide one's own vulnerability and create a world of oppression, enacting the desire to flee vulnerability in a sense, such as that of the slave master, the colonial ruler, the powerful political tyrant, the masculine subject, etc. Now, in this framework, violence against women may be understood as a special case. It is a special case in the sense that Beauvoir had pointed out, where relationality is sexed. In intersubjectivity, woman is not essential an enemy for man, not the essential or the absolute other of man who needs to be annihilated, as men of other community, class, race, country, or religion may be. Beauvoir refers to woman as an other with, if we notice in her book, with a small o in contrast to the other, non-woman other by capital O. Woman is an inessential other for man who is inferior to man and is subordinated by man. So woman never poses a threat or challenges the claims to subjectivity of man. Assertion of subjectivity for a man does not require, therefore, inflicting death to the inessential other, the woman. Thus, while violence against the enemy other is to eradicate or annihilate, violence against woman other is to have her place in the world as sexed bodies. Violence against woman is not only for the pleasures of the sex, but for reducing her subjectivity to an instrument or object, which again is operative through the enactment of the pleasures of the flesh. A myth of femininity seduces woman, Beauvoir would say. That is why women do not resist or want freedom like the slave other, the class other, or the colonized other, who aspire for freedom and subjecthood. But women do not revolt or resist to claim her subjecthood either. Woman as the sex violence is enacted to the sexed bodies qua sex, such as domestic violence, abuses, beatings, threats to keep her in place, or maybe even marital rape, where woman's subjectivity is in a frozen kind of state. Freedom for her remains an illusion, and she receives provision and protection for her loyalty. Woman as the sex, always under a threat that her worth is tied to her status as sex and her dignity is determined by the line drawn by man. If they step outside the line, they are barred from home, they are barred from the public places, and are shamed everywhere. Thus, every violent act of oppression functions as rape culture, and it is not the pleasures of the flesh that drive men. Sexual pleasure is merely instrumental. It is always the demand to be recognized as the uncontested subject for man. It is his flight from his own vulnerability embodied in the fantasies of the absolute subject. Saying this, I would like to mention Deborah Berghoffen's work. She's a feminist philosopher in this context, who also from existential phenomenologist's position takes up the notion of embodied subjectivity and differentiates between torture, slavery and rape. Of course, she considers wartime rape. Considering that the human body is always the embodiment of a meaning-making subject, she takes up 3 cases where material body of woman is abused by destroying the meaning-creating, meaning-bestowing capacity of the body. These cases show that I am exploited in order to make me an object for another's purpose, and that depletes the powers of meaning making, strips me of the values that I can create as a person, and destroys me. In case of enslavement, one can call it trafficking as well. The enslaver takes my body's existence as an object in the world and tries to erase my subjectivity, that I am subhuman with no meaning-making abilities, and reduce it to an object in the projects of the enslaver. In case of torture, it is not the fruits of my body's labor. What is usurped are my meaning-bestowing powers. The manipulation of my ambiguity is more cunningly performed here for the torturer and the wartime rapist, who, after reducing me to a mere corporeal object in their world, attempts to make me an accomplice in their world and its values because of my capacities of meaning creation. The torturer does this through forced confession, where I am forced to avow the truth of the torturer's world. And the wartime rapist uses me as an object of pleasure. In exerting power over me, he destroys the world of my people by manipulating the gendered and symbolic meanings of my body. The raped woman is expected to remain silent. Her body does the speaking. In genocide, woman's body, beside becoming an object of pleasure, is used to destroy the communal bonds of intimacy between her people. It is the family and the community in which her desire for intimacy, her sensuousness and meaning-making body finds home. The rapist destroys this woman's body as a symbol of the code of intimacy that binds her community together. The communities are also ashamed of them, and this is what the rapists want, that is to destabilize men's identities as protectors and destroy the masculine identity of the ones who witness the rape. Verhoeven takes up the wartime rape of the Bosnian-Serbian case and explains and in fact shows us that genocidal rape as a public spectacle, and this is an usual war strategy to destroy the enemy morally. To witness rape, those who witness rape but cannot protect their woman, as it is in most of the war.